this presentation. Oh. Sorry, I'll do it. I don't know if it's going to work. Is it?
There it is.
Okay. Is it up?
It's there.
Okay. Is it supposed to be safe?
It's not supposed to be. There we go. Hooray.
It's got some effect.
Like the conversion. Okay, well, black and white, there it is. Yeah, I mean, Damien said, why not go for subtle, right? And that's what I've decided to do here. Or otherwise jump the shark, I suppose, right? So in line with a lot of the discussions we've been having in the first session, and I said at the very end that both Kean and I are a bit fatigued with the concept of neoliberalism and hence organizing these panels. And this is just a reflection of basically where my thinking is at now. So, fuck neoliberalism. That's my blunt message, and I could probably end my discussion at this point and it wouldn't really matter. My position is clear, and you likely already get the gist of what I want to say. I have nothing positive to add to the discussion of neoliberalism, and to be perfectly honest, I'm quite sick of having to think about it. I've simply had enough. For a time, I had considered calling this paper Forget Neoliberalism instead, and in some ways, that's exactly what I wanted to do. I've been writing on the subject for many years, and I came to a point where I just didn't want to commit any more energy to this endeavor for fear that continuing to work around this idea was functioning to perpetuate its hold. On further reflection, I also recognize that as a political maneuver, it is potentially quite dangerous to simply stick our heads in the sand and collectively ignore a phenomenon that's had such devastating and debilitating effects on our shared world. There is an ongoing power to neoliberalism that is difficult to deny, and I'm not convinced that a strategy of ignorance is actually the right approach. So my exact thoughts were, well, fuck it then. And while a quieter and gentler name for this paper could tone down the potential offense that might come with the title I've chosen, I subsequently reconsidered. Why should we be more worried about using profanity than we are about the actual vile discourse of neoliberalism itself? I decided that I wanted to transgress, to upset, and to offend, precisely because we ought to be offended by neoliberalism. It is entirely upsetting, and therefore we should ultimately be seeking to transgress it. Wouldn't softening the title be making yet another concession to the power of neoliberalism? I initially worried that what such a title might mean in terms of my reputation. I know, what reputation? But would it hinder my future promotion or job offers? Should I want to maintain my mobility as an academic, either upwardly or to a new location? This felt like conceding personal defeat to neoliberal disciplining, and fuck that. It also felt as though I was making an admission that there was no colloquial response that could be appropriately offered to counter the discourse of neoliberalism, as though we can only respond in an academic format using complex geographical theories of variegation, hybridity, and mutation to weaken its edifice. This seemed disempowering, and although I have myself contributed to the articulation of some of these theories, I often feel that this sort of framing works against the type of argument I actually want to make. It is precisely in the everyday, the ordinary, the unremarkable, and the mundane that I think a politics of refusal must be located. And so I settled on fuck neoliberalism, because I think it conveys most of what I actually want to say. The argument I want to make is slightly more nuanced than that, which had me thinking more about the term fuck than I probably have at any other time in my life. What a fantastically colorful word. It works as a noun or a verb, and as an adjective it is perhaps the most used point of exclamation in the English language. It can be employed to express anger, contempt, annoyance, indifference, surprise, impatience, or even as a meaningless emphasis because it just rolls off the tongue. You can fuck something up, fuck someone over, fuck around, not give a fuck, and there is a decidedly geographical point of reference to the word insofar as you can be instructed to go fuck yourself. At this point, you might even be thinking, okay, but who gives a fuck? Well, I do. And if you're interested in ending neoliberalism, so should you. The powerful capacities that come with the word offer a potential challenge to neoliberalism. To dig down and unpack these abilities, we need to appreciate the nuances of what could be meant by the phrase, fuck neoliberalism. Yet at the same time, fuck nuance. As Kieran Healy has recently argued, it typically obstructs the development of theory and is theory that is intellectually interesting, empirically generative, and practically successful. So without fetishizing nuance, let's quickly work through what I think we should be prioritizing in fucking up neoliberalism. The first sense is perhaps the most obvious. By saying fuck neoliberalism, we can express our rage against the neoliberal machine. It is an indication of our anger, our desire to shout our resentment, to spew venom back in the face of the noxious malice that has been shown to us all. This can come in the form of mobilizing more protests against neoliberalism or in writing more papers and books critiquing its influence. The latter preaches to the converted, and the former hopes that the already perverted will be willing to change their ways. I don't discount that these methods are important tactics in our resistance, but I'm also quite sure that they'll never actually be enough to turn the tide against neoliberalism and in our favor. In making grand public gestures of defiance, we attempt to draw powerful actors into a conversation, mistakenly believing that they might listen and begin to accommodate the popular voice of refusal. Shouldn't we instead be done talking? Here is the second sense of fuck neoliberalism, which is found in the notion of rejection. This would be to advocate for the end of neoliberalism as we knew it in a fashion advanced by J.K. Gibson Graham, where we simply stop talking about it. Scholars in particular would discontinue prioritizing it as the focus of their studies, maybe not completely forget about it or ignore neoliberalism altogether, which I've already identified as problematic, but to instead set about getting on with our writing about other things. Once again, this is a crucially important point of contact for us to work beyond the neoliberal worldview, but here too I'm not entirely convinced that this is enough. As Mark Purcell argues, we need to turn away from neoliberalism and towards ourselves, to begin the difficult but also joyous work of managing our affairs for ourselves. While negation, protest, and critique are necessary, we also need to think about actively fucking up neoliberalism by doing things outside of its reach. Direct action beyond neoliberalism speaks to a prefigurative politics, which is the third and most important sense of what I think we should be focusing on when we invoke the idea of fuck neoliberalism. To prefigure is to reject the centrism, hierarchy, and authority that come with representative politics by emphasizing the embodied practice of enacting horizontal relationships and forms of organization that strive to reflect the future society being sought. Beyond being done talking, prefiguration and direct action contend that there was never a conversation to be had anyways, recognizing that whatever it is we want to do, we can just do it ourselves. Nonetheless, there's been significant attention to the ways in which neoliberalism is able to capture and appropriate all manner of political discourse and imperatives. For critics like David Harvey, only another dose of the state can solve the neoliberal question, where in particular he is quick to dismiss non-hierarchical organization and horizontal politics as greasing the rails for an assured neoliberal future. Yet in his pessimism, he entirely misunderstands prefigurative politics, which are a means not to an end, but only to future means. In other words, there is a constant and continual vigilance already built into prefigurative politics so that the actual practice of prefiguration cannot be co-opted. It is reflexive and intentive, but always with a view towards production, invention, and creation as a satisfaction of the desire of community. In this way, prefigurative politics are explicitly anti-neoliberal. They are a seizing of the means as our means, a means without end. To prefigure is to embrace the conviviality and joy that comes with being together as radical equals, not as vanguards and proletariat on the path towards the transcendental empty promise of utopia or no place, but as the grounded immanence of the here and now of actually making a new world in the shell of the old and the perpetual hard work and reaffirmation that this requires. There is nothing about neoliberalism that is deserving of our respect. And so in concert with the prefigurative politics of creation, my message is quite simply, fuck it. Fuck the hold that it has on our political imaginations. Fuck the violence it engenders. Fuck the inequality it extols as a virtue. Fuck the way it ravaged the environment. Fuck the endless cycle of accumulation and the cult of growth. Fuck the Mont Pelerin Society and the think tanks that continue to prop it up and promote it. Fuck Friedrich Hayek and Milton Friedman for saddling us with their ideas. Fuck the Thatchers, the Reagans, and all the cowardly self-interested politicians who seek only to scratch the back of avarice. Fuck the fear-mongering exclusion that sees others as worthy of cleaning our toilets and mopping our floors, but not as members of our communities. Fuck the ever-intensifying move towards metrics and the failure to appreciate that not everything that counts can be counted. Fuck the desire for profit over the needs of community. Fuck absolutely everything neoliberalism stands for, and fuck the Trojan horse that it rode in on. For far too long, we've been told that there is no alternative, that a rising tide lifts all boats, that we live in a Darwinian nightmare world of all against all survival of the fittest. We've swallowed the idea of the tragedy of the commons hook, line, and sinker, when in reality this is a ruse that actually reflects the tragedy of capitalism and its endless wars of plunder. Garrett Hardin's Achilles' heel was that he never stopped to think about how grazing cattle were already privately owned. What might happen when we reconvene an actual commons as a commons, without presuppositions of private ownership? What might happen when we start to pay closer attention to the prefiguration of alternatives that are already happening and privileging these experiences as the most important forms of organization? What might happen when instead of swallowing the bitter pills of competition and merit, we instead focus our energies not on medicating ourselves with neoliberal prescriptions, but on the deeper healing that comes with cooperation and mutual aid? Jamie Peck once called neoliberalism a radical political slogan, but it is no longer enough to dwell within the realm of critique. Many years have passed since we first identified the enemy, and from that time we have come to know it well through our writing and protests. But even when we are certain of its defeat, as in the aftermath of the 2008 financial crisis and the subsequent Occupy movement, it continues to gasp for air and reanimate itself in a more powerful zombified form. Jaffe Wilson calls this ongoing power the neoliberal Gothic, and I'm convinced that in order to overcome this horror show, we must move our politics into the realm of the inactive. What if fuck neoliberalism were to become a mantra for a new kind of politics? An enabling phrase that spoke not only to action, but to the reclamation of our lives and the spaces and moments in which we actually live them. What if every time we use this phrase, we recognize that it meant a call for an active agency that went beyond mere words, combining theory and practice into the beautiful praxis of prefiguration? We must take a multi-pronged approach to our rejection of neoliberalism. While we can't entirely ignore it or forget it, we can actively work against it in ways that extend beyond the performance of rhetoric and the rhetoric of performance. By all means, let's advance a new radical political slogan. Use a hashtag, fuck neoliberalism, and make our contempt go viral. But we have to do more than express our indignation. We have to enact our resolve and realize our hope as the imminence of our embodied experiences in the here and now. We need to remake the world ourselves, a process that cannot be postponed. We've willfully diluted and disempowered ourselves by continuing to appeal to the existing political arrangement of representation. Our blind faith has us waiting endlessly for a savior to drop from the sky. The system has proven itself to be thoroughly corrupt, where time and time again our next great political candidate proves to be a failure. In this neoliberal moment, it's not a case of mere problematic individuals being in power. Instead, it is our very belief in the system itself that epitomizes the core of the problem. We produce and enable the institutional conditions for the Lucifer effect to play itself out. The banality of evil is such that these politicians are just doing their jobs in a system that rewards perversions of power because it is all designed to serve the laws of capitalism. But we don't have to obey. We're not beholden to this order. Through our direct action and the organization of alternatives, we can indict the entire structure and break this vicious cycle of abuse. When the political system is defined, conditioned, enmeshed, and derived from capitalism, it can never represent our ways of knowing and being in the world. And so we need to take charge of these lifeways and reclaim our collective agency. We must start to become inactive in our politics and begin embracing a more relational sense of solidarity that recognizes that the subjugation and suffering of one is in fact indicative of the oppression of all. We can start living into the other possible worlds through a renewed commitment to the practices of mutual aid, fellowship, reciprocity, and non-hierarchical forms of organization that reconvene democracy in its etymological sense of power to the people. Ultimately, neoliberalism is a particularly foul idea that comes with a whole host of vulgar outcomes and crass assumptions. In response, it deserves to be met with equally offensive language and action. Our community, our cooperation, and our care for one another are all loathsome to neoliberalism. It hates that which we celebrate. So when we say fuck neoliberalism, let it mean more than just words. Let it be an enactment of our commitment to each other. Say it loud, say it with me, and say it to anyone who will listen, but most of all, mean it as a clarion call to action and the embodiment of our prefigurative power to change the fucking world. So I've got one final thought to impart to you, and I mean this with all seriousness. Fuck neoliberalism.
Questions, so, okay, so one second.
I have two things I just wanted to say. Aren't you worried that with your whole campaign to create a hashtag, based on this concept that you hate, that you may be reinscribing and reifying it all over again? And then the second thing is, you say you want a society that's based on mutual aid, reciprocity, and reconstituting this idea of the commons, past private property, but yet you don't want to use revolution to get there. You call it a utopia, a no place, or whatever. You cast aspersions on ideas of the proletariat and a vanguard party and things like that, but mutual aid and reciprocity, man, that's the free association of the commons, dude. It's the free association of the producers. It's communism. So what the hell? Why are you leading us down this road that's against Marx, that's against where all these ideas came from, just calling it something else?
Because all these ideas didn't come from Marx. They are socialist ideas that Marx was one of the participants in articulating them. So I'm an anarchist, I'm not a Marxist. So ideas of mutual aid and reciprocity and cooperation, these are all anarchist ideas. And so there is a dominant sort of orthodoxy within radical geography that I've been writing against for many years, against the Marxist orthodoxy that we see in the discipline, wanting to write from an anarchist perspective. So I haven't used the word anarchism in this talk, but effectively that's what I'm talking about, is an opportunity to move beyond neoliberalism. We don't have to think of a revolutionary moment to do this, right? We have the capacity. That implies a politics of waiting, right? The revolution, well, maybe it'll come, but we'll wait for it. We'll wait for somebody else to do the work of it when we can actually do the work ourselves, right here in the here and now. So the revolution of the everyday, if you're stuck on the word revolution, think of it as an everyday process rather than something that is an ideal somewhere in the future. It's something that we can embrace here and now in this moment.
Question over here.
So, thank you from a mildly, well, for me mildly and for Andrew less mildly anarchist corner of the room. But I will say that I want to push a little bit on the idea that neoliberalism hates these ideas of reciprocity and mutual obligation and mutual care because, and this relates completely to Keaton's talk, the contract is something that for us is legally enforced, for those of us especially who don't have the money to pay court costs, is legally enforced and comes down to like life and death stuff, like going to jail stuff. For corporations, breaking a contract is an economic decision. And part of what neoliberalism is, I think, is the juxtaposition between the corporation saying, I can break my contract if it'll save money in the long run, and the idea that we need to honor our contracts, honor our obligations. So especially thinking here about the mortgage crisis and what it means to sort of pay your debts, what it means to sort of do that, have that moral obligation of social indebtedness. I think it's not quite easy enough to say we nurture these things because I think in some ways they are wrapped up in the process we're trying to get outside of. So how do we parse that co-option, if you want to call it that?
Yeah, I mean, that's the most difficult question, right, is the potential for co-option. But I think we have to, I mean, that's where I'm sort of stuck in my thinking. On the one hand, I want to say, fuck this concept, forget it. But at the same time, there's something powerful about it that I can't quite get to the point of just wanting to forget it, just ignoring it altogether. I mean, David Graeber has written a great book on debt and the idea of the morality of capitalism and these kinds of, not specifically on contracts, so there's more work to be done there in terms of the morality that's implied in those, but there are yeah, there's a critical question to be asked in the way that we absorb this sort of script that tells us we have to behave as economic actors in certain kinds of ways. And I mean, Richard White, who's in the back there, he's written, there's an emerging body of work that he's writing on that's sort of in the vein of J.K. Gibson Graham, but also in a very anarchist vein, to start thinking through how we're already this other world that we're wanting to achieve. It's actually right here with us, right? We only need to start looking at it. And I mean, we had this conversation this morning in the Anarchist Geographies sessions about just the conviviality in the room and the mutual respect that was in that space, and we all had a laugh that this is anarchism, and then we stopped and said, well, this is anarchism, right? We are creating in this room the kind of society we would like to see, rather than playing, you know, when we started to have conversations about all the kinds of problematics that come with being an academic and the pressures that are on us and the way that we could collectively kind of push back against these. And there's, you know, we don't have to actually look very far, and this is in Richard's work, that it's happening all around us. We just need to be willing to engage in a hopeful sort of politics that focuses our lens on those things rather than on all the sort of negative things that are going on. And Mark Purcell as well, I don't know if he's here, but he was with us this morning. The Handbook of Neoliberalism, the final, if I can plug the handbook again, the final chapter was written by Mark, and it's my favorite chapter of the entire volume because Mark is pointing to the joyous politics of moving on, right? And so we reflect on Mark's comments and on his paper in the introduction with a sort of invocation that we hope that, you know, very soon that this handbook will